She looked up at him and asked if he was sad. Nobody had asked Nathaniel Cross that question in 11 years, not his board. Not his doctors. Not the string of women who left before the coffee got cold. And here was a 4-year-old with a stuffed fox under one arm, waiting for an answer like it was the simplest thing in the world. This is the story of how she got one. Nathaniel Cross was 52 years old and worth just north of $9 billion, and he had a phrase engraved on a brass plate on his desk that read, "Comfort is for people who have stopped trying." He believed it. He'd built 3 companies on it, a logistics empire, a chain of private hospitals, and a data firm that quietly ran half the world's shipping routes without anyone outside the industry knowing its name. From the 40th floor of the Cross Meridian Tower, the city below looked like something you could own outright. If you just worked hard enough, wanted it badly enough, refused to blink. What nobody in that tower knew, not his assistant, not his general counsel, not a single member of the board that had feared and admired him in equal measure for 2 decades, was that Nathaniel Cross had been dying for the better part of a year. It started as headaches he blamed on fluorescent light. Then a heaviness in his legs he blamed on age. Then on a Tuesday in early spring, he collapsed getting out of a car outside his own office, and the tests that followed used words doctors only use when they've run out of gentler ones. Aggressive, advanced, comfort-focused care, a specialist named Dr. Priya Anand, calm and precise in the way people are when they've delivered this news too many times to let their voice shake, told him he likely had somewhere between 8 months and a year, depending on how his body responded to treatment and how much treatment he was willing to endure. He chose very little treatment. He chose a great deal of privacy. Within 2 weeks, he'd quietly converted the east wing of his countryside estate, a gray stone manor outside a town called Ashford Hollow, 3 hours from the city. Bought 9 years earlier mostly because it had a lake nobody was allowed to swim in and 14 rooms nobody was allowed to mess up, into a private recovery suite. A medical team signed confidentiality agreements before they'd even drawn blood. His housekeeper was told to prepare a quiet space for extended rest. His brother was told nothing at all because he and his brother hadn't spoken in 6 years. Not since a business dispute over a warehouse deal in Denver that Nathaniel could no longer entirely remember the details of, only the anger which had outlived the facts. He didn't want to die at the estate. He just didn't have anywhere else that felt like it belonged to him and not to a version of him built for cameras. The staff there had always kept a careful, professional distance, the way Nathaniel had trained every employee he'd ever had to keep it. Mrs. Whitfield, the head housekeeper, ran the house like a ship that wasn't allowed to list even an inch. The 2 groundskeepers moved through the property like weather, present, necessary, unremarkable. And then there was the newest hire, a woman named Alina Marsh, quiet and quick and thorough, who'd started 3 months earlier and who Nathaniel had passed in the hallway exactly 4 times without learning her last name. He didn't know she had a daughter. Nobody had thought to mention it because it wasn't relevant. Because Alina kept her home life folded up small and tucked away the way people do when they're one bad week from losing the roof over their heads. Her daughter was 4 years old, with a gap where her front baby tooth had just come out, and hair that never sat right no matter how carefully Alina parted it in the morning. And a laugh that came from somewhere below her ribs and rolled out of her like something too big for such a small person to be carrying. Her name was Nora. Nora Marsh was not supposed to be in the East Wing that Thursday. Alina's usual after-school arrangement had fallen through overnight, and Mrs. Whitfield, who was strict but not without a heart she kept carefully hidden, had allowed it just this once. The girl could sit in the staff kitchen with her crayons and her stuffed fox while her mother finished a deep clean of the east hallway that couldn't wait. Quiet, contained, invisible, Nora had other ideas, she always did. Nathaniel was in the reading chair in the east sitting room that afternoon, the one closest to the medical suite. The one he retreated to on the days the medication made his joints feel like they'd been filled with wet sand. There was a paperback open on his knee that he wasn't reading. He was watching the birch tree outside the window start to turn gold at the tips, and thinking, in the detached way he thought about most things now, about whether he was frightened. He'd decided he wasn't. He'd beaten men twice his size in boardrooms for 30 years. He wasn't going to let a diagnosis be the thing that finally cracked him. That was the exact moment the door, left unlatched by a nurse an hour earlier, swung open, and a small person in green rain boots wandered in, dragging a stuffed fox by one ear. A purple crayon tucked behind her ear like a pencil behind a carpenter's. She stopped. She looked at him. And instead of the crying or the freezing or any of the sensible reactions a small child might have to a strange man in a strange chair, she smiled at him like they were already old friends. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Nathaniel said back. The word felt unfamiliar in his mouth, like a language he'd stopped practicing. Here's the thing about very small children, they don't see what the rest of the world trains itself to see. They don't see the number in the financial press, or the tailored suit, or the particular stillness in a man's face that says approach at your own risk. They see a lap. They see whether your eyes look tired or kind. Nora looked at Nathaniel Cross and saw, simply, a sad man sitting alone by a window. That was the whole of it, that was everything she needed to know. She crossed the room in 4 determined little steps, the fox dragging behind her, and stopped at the footstool in front of his chair. "You sad?" she asked. Nathaniel Cross had sat across from senators. He had sat across from men who wanted to destroy him and had, on 2 separate occasions, nearly succeeded. Nobody had ever asked him that question with that particular bluntness. No performance in it, no strategy, nothing to gain. "I'm fine," he said the way he always said it. She tilted her head, unconvinced, and held out the fox. "This is Biscuit," she announced, with the gravity of a formal introduction. "He helps when you're sad." It was, by any objective measure, a deeply unremarkable object, one ear worn to almost nothing, an eye hanging by a thread, fur gone flat and gray from years of love. It was also, Nathaniel understood instantly, the single most valuable thing this child owned. "Thank you," he said, and took it with both hands. Something moved in his chest that had nothing to do with the tumor. Something old and long bricked over and almost unrecognizable. Satisfied, Nora surveyed the room the way children do when they're deciding whether a space has potential, spotted the wide arm of the reading chair, gripped the seat cushion, and with tremendous effort and total confidence hauled herself up onto it. She sat there, feet dangling, utterly at home. "Read," she said, pointing at his book. "I wasn't really reading it." "Read it," she said again, more firmly. And Nathaniel Cross, who had not taken an unsolicited instruction from another human being in perhaps 3 decades, opened the book, glanced at a page of dense adult prose that meant nothing to a 4-year-old, flipped instead to the blank end papers at the back, and began haltingly. Making up a story about a fox named Biscuit who lived at the edge of a garden and had adventures nobody else knew about. His voice was stiff at first, unpracticed, the way a voice sounds after years of only being used to negotiate. Nora didn't care. She leaned her small shoulder against his arm and listened with an intensity Nathaniel had only ever seen on the faces of lawyers when 9 figures were on the table. He talked for almost 20 minutes. He could not remember the last time he'd spoken for 20 minutes without an agenda attached to every sentence. When Alina appeared in the doorway, she'd spent 10 frantic minutes searching the wing. Hard in her throat, her face went white at the sight of her daughter perched on the billionaire's chair like she owned it. "Mr. Cross, I am so sorry." She got out of the kitchen. "I told her to stay. This will never—" "It's all right," he said. She stopped mid-sentence. He looked at her properly for maybe the first time, dark eyes like her daughter's, an open, unguarded face gone tight with fear that made him feel uncomfortably like a man who'd spent a long time being frightening to people who had no reason to fear him. "She can stay," he said. "If you need her to." "She was reading with me," Nora corrected very seriously. "Reading," Alina repeated. "Throne stories," Nora said. "About Biscuit." He handed the fox back. She tucked it under her chin the way she always did, then looked up at Nathaniel and delivered her verdict with total conviction. "Tomorrow." He opened his mouth to explain that tomorrow he had calls, that this had been a one-time thing, that the East Wing wasn't a place for children. Every sentence the man he'd been for 52 years would have said without thinking twice. "Tomorrow," he said instead. It became a routine, and Nathaniel understood routines. His entire adult life had run on them, every hour blocked, every minute pointed at some outcome. This routine had no outcome attached to it at all. There was no deliverable, no return. There was only Nora arriving at 2 in the afternoon like a small, unstoppable weather system, climbing into the chair beside him, and teaching him things he hadn't known he still needed to learn. The first thing she taught him was how to look at something slowly. One afternoon she found a beetle on the windowsill and studied it for 11 full minutes. He timed it, first with the impatience of a man for whom time had always meant money, and then, somewhere around minute 7, with something closer to wonder. "What's it thinking about?" he asked. She considered this like it deserved real consideration. "Lunch," she said. He laughed, not the practiced transactional laugh he used in meetings, but something that came from low in his chest, surprised out of him. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened either. The second thing she taught him was how to ask for help. She needed things constantly: a cup of water, a dropped crayon retrieved from under the rug, a boost to see out a window that was, to her, impossibly tall. She asked without a trace of shame, the same way she'd announced she was hungry. Nathaniel had spent 5 decades treating every admission of need as a weakness to be quietly patched over with more work, less sleep, harder edges. Watching a 4-year-old say, "I need help," like it was the most obvious sentence in the world did something to him he didn't have words for yet. He started making calls he'd been avoiding. One of them was to his brother. He didn't mention the diagnosis. He wasn't ready for that yet. He just called unannounced on a Tuesday night, and when his brother Julian picked up with the wary, clipped hello of a man expecting an old wound to reopen, Nathaniel said, "I've been thinking about the Denver deal. I think I was wrong." Silence on the line. "You think you were wrong," Julian repeated slowly. "I know I was wrong. I was being stubborn and it cost us 6 years and I'm sorry." More silence, then a sound that was half laugh, half something rower. "Took you long enough," Julian said. "How are you?" Nathaniel asked and meant it. The third thing Nora taught him was presence, though she'd never have called it that. She was constitutionally incapable of being anywhere except exactly where she was. When she colored with her whole body. When she ate the shortbread the estate's chef started quietly leaving out for their afternoons, she ate it with total, crumb-scattering joy. Nathaniel began leaving his phone in the other room during their 2 o'clock hour. Dr. Annan noticed the change in his labs before she noticed the reason for it. "Your blood pressure's down. Your cortisol's better than it's been in months. Are you doing something differently?" "I've been telling stories," he said. "Keep doing that," she said, and meant it as medicine. Alina noticed too. She began to soften around him, the way a bird stops flinching once it realizes the hand near it isn't going to move. She started answering his nods in the hallway with actual sentences. That Nora had had a cough but was better now, that Nora had asked at dinner whether the window man had remembered to eat. "She calls you the window man," Alina said, mortified. "I'll tell her your real name." "I like it," Nathaniel said. "Window man's fine by me." One gray Wednesday, rain streaking the glass, Nora climbed into his lap instead of the chair arm. He went very still. She arranged herself with brisk efficiency, tucked biscuit under her chin, and looked up at him. "Are you gonna be okay?" The question landed with a weight that had nothing to do with the size of the person asking it. "I don't know," Nathaniel said. He had never said that sentence out loud to anyone, not once in 52 years. Nora thought about this the way she thought about beetles. "My mama says some things are hard," she said finally, "but you don't gotta be scared of 'em, you just gotta hold somebody." Then she took his hand in both of her small ones and held it. Nathaniel Cross sat very still in the gray afternoon light, in an estate with 14 rooms he'd never once walked into, holding the hand of a 4-year-old, and understood. For the first time in longer than he could measure, that he wasn't alone. November arrived cold and final, the way it always does. Nathaniel's condition had moved the way Dr. Anand had gently warned him it would, not in one dramatic collapse but in increments. More fatigue, longer hours in the medical suite. Mornings when the 14 acres outside looked less like something he owned and more like something he was slowly being asked to hand back. He made changes quietly and thoroughly, the way he approached everything that mattered. He called Foster, his attorney of nearly 20 years, and over 3 long sessions they rebuilt his estate plan from the ground up. The charitable arm of Cross Meridian, which had existed mostly as a tax line item for a decade, was refunded, restructured, and pointed at something specific. Early childhood care access for working parents in under-resourced neighborhoods, starting with the one he'd grown up in. He signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon with a steadiness that surprised even him. He called Julian every week after that, sometimes about business. More often about their father, about the house they'd grown up in and eventually lost, about the years between them that couldn't be gotten back and the ones that still could. Julian drove up one weekend and sat across from him in the east sitting room, coffee in hand, and Nathaniel told him everything: the diagnosis, the timeline, the whole shape of it. Julian cried. Nathaniel sat with the discomfort of being witnessed like that and didn't try to fix it or hurry it along. He just stayed while his brother cried. It was, he thought later, one of the more intimate things he'd experienced in his adult life. He also gave Alina a raise substantial enough that her hands shook a little when she saw the new number. Then he called her into the sitting room, Nora trailing behind in a yellow raincoat despite the fact that it wasn't raining. Purely because she'd wanted to wear it, and laid out what he wanted to do. A fully funded, irrevocable education trust for Nora, covering everything from kindergarten through graduate school if she wanted it. Full health coverage for both of them, independent of Alina's job status. And the old stone cottage on the south edge of the property, used for years to store gardening equipment, renovated and given to Alina outright, hers for as long as she wanted it. Alina sat very still through all of it, hands folded, eyes bright. Why? She asked finally. Nathaniel looked over at Nora, who had climbed onto the footstool and was pulling books off the shelf and putting them back in the wrong order with total obliviousness to the size of the conversation happening 2 feet away. Because she walked through a door I'd forgotten I left open, he said, and she reminded me what it felt like to be a person instead of a name on a building. Alina pressed her fingers to her mouth. It took her a moment to speak. She talks about you every night, she said quietly, tells her toys about the stories. The stories are getting better, Nathaniel said, almost smiling. Biscuits had quite a season. Nora turned from the shelf holding an atlas nearly as big as her torso, carried it over with enormous effort and dropped it in his lap. Maps, she announced. Read maps. Maps aren't really for reading. Everything's for reading, she informed him in a tone that closed the subject permanently. So he opened it and she climbed up and he told her about places not as facts but as stories. Rivers so wide you couldn't see the far bank. Mountains that touched the clouds every single morning like they were saying hello. A city with alleys so narrow the neighbors could shake hands across them from their windows. A forest where the trees had gotten so old they'd stopped bothering to count the years. Nora listened with her whole body, the way she always did. Outside, the season's first snow had started to fall. Nathaniel watched it, really watched it, the way she taught him to watch things and thought simply this is beautiful. No calculation attached, no thought of what it cost or what it was worth. Just beauty, unpurchasable, falling over 14 acres he was learning, too late and just in time to actually see. He felt grateful. He hadn't felt that in longer than he could remember. There's one more thing you should know before this ends, and it isn't the part you're expecting. Nathaniel Cross died on a Thursday morning in late February, with snow still on the ground and pale gray light just starting to come through the east window. He wasn't alone. Julian had driven up the night before, once Dr. Annan made the call that they were close. He sat on one side of the bed. On the other side, dragged in from the sitting room at Nathaniel's specific request, was his reading chair and curled up in it, asleep, head tipped sideways, biscuit tucked under her chin. Was Nora Marsh. Alina stood near the window, watching the snow, past crying now and into the quieter place grief goes once it runs out of words. Earlier that morning, while he could still speak clearly, Nathaniel had held his brother's hand, looked over at the sleeping child in the chair and said, voice thin but steady. She fixed something in me. What did she fix? Julian asked. Nathaniel thought about it. The part of me that forgot I was a person, he said. She looked at a sad man by a window and decided he needed a story more than she needed her own toy. Nobody's done that for me, ever. 2 weeks earlier, he'd asked Alina's permission for one more thing. He'd had a small illustrated book made, real bound, printed, collecting every story he'd told Nora that autumn, written down as best he could remember them. Painted by an artist connected to the foundation. The fox in the garden, the fox crossing the wide river, the fox in the mountains, in the narrow alley in the ancient forest. On the dedication page it read simply, for Nora who opened the door. And for Alina who let her. That book was tucked against Nora's chest when she woke that morning slowly, the way children wake, small movements, then all at once. She looked at the bed, at Julian. At her mother who crossed the room and gathered her up without a word. Is he sleeping? Nora asked. Alina held her tighter. He's resting, baby. Nora nodded, looked toward the window, toward the snow and the thin gray light, and said with the plain certainty of someone stating a fact, he was nice. He told good stories. Julian, across the room, made a sound he had to cover with his hand. He would tell this story for the rest of his life, at the foundation's opening, to his own kids one day, to any reporter who asked what had changed his brother in those final months. He always ended it the same way. A 4-year-old walked through an unlatched door, climbed into a dying man's chair, handed him a worn-out stuffed fox, and gave him his heart back with it. The Cross Family Foundation, in its new form, opened over 60 early childhood centers in its first 3 years. In the very first one, in the same Baltimore neighborhood Nathaniel had grown up in, and his own father had eventually lost everything trying to hold on to. There's a small plaque near the reading corner, a painted fox, 2 small handprints pressed in on opening day, and underneath in plain lettering. Every child deserves someone who tells them good stories. Every heart deserves a door left open. Alina and Nora lived in the stone cottage for years afterward. Nora grew up running across those 14 acres, through the garden Nathaniel had never once walked in, around the lake he'd only ever watched from a distance. She learned every path on that property by heart. Sometimes, older now 9 or 10, she'd sit in that same east-sitting room and read real books this time. Not the atlas, with the same full-body attention her mother always said she'd had since she could barely walk. On the windowsill of that room sits a small stuffed fox, one ear worn nearly to nothing, one eye hanging by a thread, soft from years of being carried and pressed against a small, sleeping face. Alina put it there herself the spring after Nathaniel died and never once moved it. Felt right, she said once, that he stay in the room where it all started. Where a man who had everything finally figured out what he was missing. A little girl who had almost nothing gave away the one thing she loved most, without thinking twice about it. Because she looked at a sad man by a window and decided, the way only very young children can, that he needed it more than she did. Some doors, once they're open, change everything on both sides of them, so here's what I keep coming back to. If you'd walked into that room instead of Nora, if you were the one sitting in that chair, or the one who wandered in with a toy and a question, what do you think you would have said? Let me know where you're watching this from tonight. And if this one got you, even a little, do me a favor, hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and tell me in the comments what you would have done in Nathaniel's chair. I read every single one.